Schönen guten Morgen, this is Shirley Youngwood with Sirius, Taurus, Moon, Venus, our Mars Day. Venus 5 degrees, Virgo, Ascendant applying to the Sun at 20 degrees Cancer, and Mercury is retrograde, Mars 11 degrees Gemini, in the 12th house, ruling the Ascendant. Now, let's talk about things that are bad for business. One thing is coming from watching a comment on a Leonardo da Vinci short. And that comment talked about the fact that Leonardo da Vinci's father did not acknowledge him. He was a nobleman, but he sent him to school. And people were wondering, huh? What we need to understand is around transits like the bisextile, the harmony between Pluto, Uranus, and Neptune, it's difficult to understand how come a father would not acknowledge a child but would fund for its schooling, which is way more than acknowledging a child. What we have this century that is about to begin to end from the 2030s to the 2060s, and that is the Pluto-Neptune sextile. And right now we are in between bisextiles. We are in a bisextile with Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus that the Moon is triggering today, and Jupiter is about to trigger in the Barbados basket. People call it the War of the Titans. And I'm one of the Titans, which is why I make this episode. But when we don't have this harmony, we had times where monarchies had to break down a church to divorce. Bankers try to cash in on the debt that they have opiately put monarchies in. That's the truth. What is the Epstein dossiers? It's an extortion codes that get aristocracy to do horrible things under shit ton of drugs in front of cameras and then extort not just money but access to resources. The problem with most sovereign countries, Israel, is that they were formed in much similar fashion. Now, land is difficult to reach and sustain. The closest we have is example of people like the Kalash people that were sustaining land in the face of Afghani Taliban regime using strong matriarchal principles. Not unlike the Minan Kibao, but differently in the sense that the Minan Kibao had men in the power structures and women at home, so women still felt resented, but they didn't convert, let's say, to the Jesuit that are more associated with the Inquisition, with the ritual abuse streams of Christianity, or the union between Judaic tradition and Christian traditions. Now, all of those aspects, the fact that there are times when the bankers or the banking elite tries to cash in on the debt of the monarchy. For example, the French Revolution is one of those times. Whereas there are times where the outer planets work together, which is all the three outer planets is relatively rare. We had Gladio Operation, which was mafia snitching, becoming informant, the trading with the church under governance and overruled by a banking energy infrastructure elite. Okay, that's at the aftermath of the Second World War. Women got the right to vote. They had their own bank account. And now we're dealing with both the upside and the downside. Um, in those times where one had to break down a church, for a nobleman, it would be easier to not acknowledge a biological child, or even acknowledge a non-biological child. But particularly in lineages where there is ritual abuse, and they send the children, some of the children come back from school, some of the children don't. The training borders the extremes. So of course children are trained to in kidnapping scenarios, in hunting scenarios, but the threshold where a child can die, where a child can go through a rite of passage that is affecting things, where an infant could be subjected to rituals that affect their ability. Leonardo da Vinci was one of the famous Renaissance people, but he had a lot of self-doubt, a lot of anxiety, and that has to do with the infant phase of the elite, of the noble people. Okay, innovation on that is very difficult because those circles are very closed and everybody is silenced. So, but innovation on that, for example, if you think about the branch of the Rothschild that tried to not do inbreeding and thus sustained the Second World War, where a time where eugenics um, were very prevalent. Now everybody's looking at genetics, but people forget epigenetics. And this was easier to acknowledge a child, or easier to fund for the studies of a child, than to acknowledge a child that was, let's say, considered illegitimate by the church. Why? For the former, you would need to change the church. However, Leonardo da Vinci challenged the church. The banking elite, which was the Medicis, erected both the Pope and the scientists that would argue with the Pope. Okay? This is superseding the Rothschild, except that the Rothschild and the Rockefellers erected also the funding for women's rights, and thus they have um, placed themselves in a significant placement that can be completely different legacies than the Medici, but will we in not several hundred years think of um, women rights as the second Medicis? I don't know. Now, what do you do to beat the Jews? How do you beat the Jews? They say they did a lot of good things. Women rights, something that one cannot argue with. Cross classicism. A working class person being able, even through the horrid medical experiment society, get funding for a first degree. Then step into the second degree, and then the threshold was what? The exchange of seers. For Googleplex people, what is that glass ceiling threshold? It touches on the issues of the funding. However, up until that glass ceiling, we had cross classicism that was unprecedented. Now, when we're thinking in terms of centuries, we ask ourselves, okay, so how do we beat the Jews? Which I already mentioned. The Jews came as far as to give scholarship across classes. For example, if I think about my family, then my mother side were working class in Israel, Palestine, in the city. In the city, it's considered working class, not aristocracy, not elite. Outside of the city, they were Ashkenazi. Outside of the city, they considered the elite. They say, oh, they better move outside the city. No, because they weren't considered the underdog. And then they were treated like they eat the rich, but they were working class. Fascinating. Within a country that has um, less than 500 kilometers between its south and north, such tremendous diversity and complete lack of awareness of who is the marginalized. It has upsides and it has downsides. Now, um, also people that came back from let's say, immigrated from Morocco, some immigrated from the city, with completely different cultures, some immigrated from the villages, completely different. But people outside see people came in from the Maghreb. And what it created, Ben Gurion wanted to put the people, and probably if we'll have a Palestinian Ben Gurion will probably think about the same things. Oh, we're going to put them in cities around the border, settlements, and then give what? Some sort of a factory, some sort of a industrial boom, so they'll have jobs. And what happened if that factory failed? The entire city went down. The people from the Maghreb felt that they were abused, oppressed, enslaved, decided for them, okay, that person will be in construction. He used to have a restaurant. That was supposed to be the promised land. The people at the regime said, oh, these people are sand of the earth, they're salt of the earth. They can build the country. Okay, just that lack of communication built almost a century of friction. Now, for Leonardo da Vinci's father to acknowledge his by the church illegitimate child, he would need to change the church, go fight with the church. Da Vinci did it, and he did it scientifically. The Medicis funded for that. Now, those little intricacies are very important to know because there are a lot of open doors where we think that those are closed. And there are a lot of weirdnesses. Now, why wouldn't the church acknowledge the illegitimate child? Unfortunately, because the children used for the rituals were of noblemen, but they had to have an excuse. They couldn't acknowledge these children because they had to create the type of children that it's okay to use, whether it is for trafficking, whether it is for, and what was trafficking? It was diplomacy. A child looks appeasing to the other aristocracy, the other royalties, the other elites. The torture, they have a conscience of an adult within them, and they have what? Espionage. Now, it works across religions in as much as it works across baronets and aristocracy. This is why when they talked about the Epsteins, they said they worked a different God than the worked outside. When we think about Christ and Antichrist, it's basically an attempt to manage two religions and cash in on 555, the arguments within them. Now, what if we didn't really have to do that? What if we didn't really have to torture people to be able to hold and accommodate for divergent opinions, divergent strategies, without having to harm the infant phase that undermines the entire empire, whether it's a banking empire, aristocracy, a religious or conglomerate of religious elites. That's how we beat the Jews. And we have a point around the bigger sun, around Sirius. The Egyptians were building pyramids. They were building pyramids to receive a gnosis. They were basically an altar to receive a gnosis from the gods, from the bigger sun. And the gnosis that came was aligning basically the microcosmic orbit, the orgasmic birthing type of breathing, bringing the energy from the spine up and down on the out breath. It's a form of circulating a life energy, our sexual energy, in a way that enhances not just the orgasmic self, but the entire spiritual experience of the passage between worlds. It's basically birthing babies. Now, the elite didn't have that. They had harems, which negates orgasmic birthing. And then with that gnosis, they had to release the slaves that built the pyramids, but not only that, those slaves had to purify themselves from all the previous rituals, basically to get to that gnosis, which we never got to in the Promised Land with the Old Testament. And that's how you beat the Jews. Now, either the Jews would accommodate, which maybe they can, or they will be superseded by those that bring back orgasmic birthing, not just for leaders, but also for people. Not just for people, but also for leaders. In such trajectory, we don't have dipped, because we don't have slavery, and we need not have trafficking, so we don't have risk of intelligence infiltration and assassination through extortion. Now that's being a titan. What can be built with that? When we look at the slopes of one of the major seas, and one of the major seas is not the biggest sea, it's actually the lowest sea. It's the sea that everybody comes to treat their skin problems. Because in that juncture is a junction of energy infrastructure. We have the full capacity, even just to send out beavers down the slope of the Dead Sea, build dams and half moons that completely rewild the area and prevent the flood that is already arriving, even from Jerusalem, from basically being a risk. A lot of people come to watch the floods. Every year people die, but we already have the water. If we build the structure, we can have hydropower. One country that uses hydropower, although it has oil and gas, is Norwegian. We have enough sun. We can even make water from the air, but we don't need to. If we harvest the water on the slopes to the Dead Sea and purify them, we're basically solving the entire water problem in the Middle East. People will not have to pay for water. Water dependency peace is something that also honors the water, which is the microcosmic orbit. The water breaks the head of the baby appear. Now, all of these slopes to the Dead Sea will become a breathing lungs. People think, oh, it's a beautiful desert. It's a beautiful desert. Amazing sunrises. It was not a desert. In cities around Beersheba, Arad, you can see the sugar canes top the back of the camel. Camel was not a desert animal. In that way, we can also remineralize the area. And that is Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, even Syria, because we go all the way from the jurisdiction is no longer a servant of slave owners. Which means that there is a place for life. Right now, Israel is dealing, and Israel is the Jews. On whichever side of the equation, people see that this separation is artificial. The fifth house, Pluto, transiting Pluto to the fifth house, exposing what happened to the infant, to the children, not just in Israel, but it's exposing that in Israel. It won't be able to be ignored. And how that affects our ability to have sovereignty in our borders. But it also exposes our borders. It's not just Israel that has this, that has to beat the Jews, but everyone around. The Islamicate Golden Age will not be superseding, it will be surpassed by those who will apply the orgasmic birthing. Which negates what? It negates wedding at puberty. It negates also neurodegenerative disease, cancer, the teeth of the children. it shifts our thinking of resources not as a monetary, because right now it's possible to manufacture gold. Gold standard is now fiat. What does it mean? Are we going back to silver? Tomorrow we'll be able to manufacture silver. So what have we got? The money becomes a no money. The coin, remember the time where people took money from the ATM and the money began to dissolve, happening in ATMs in Germany. But fresh air, orgasmic birthing, upbringings that are joyous, residence that is in itself a vacation, it's a lifestyle. Unprecedented peace as area that was laden with war over nothing. Relationships that are not transactional, they're actually authentic. That's the juncture of potentials that we're standing within today. Now, how is it going to affect the ecosystem? If the weather here is good, it will be very good at the poles. You say, surely, oh my God, will the ice freeze? Will the ice melt? No, we're going to have more equilibrium of temperatures. That means less volcanic eruption. And by the way, we will have the technology in Iceland. One of the eruptions was slow enough so that people could install pipes using the allyship of the United States and literally point freezing water at the lava, and all they had to do is to freeze the upper layer. Now, scale that up, and we can prepare for volcanic eruptions, not just of magma form, but also of carbon dioxide form, which means we will not build around volcanoes. Just think about cities around Indonesia, around Krakatau, that could have a nice residence, particularly around. Right now, we are susceptible to have the big earthquake. But they could have the ability to be in a place where they're safe after the earthquake. Now, how should I say that? Earthquake is about friction, or is about friction. So the friction can be the wetness of the soil meets hotter temperatures at the core. Okay, think what can create friction? Anomalies in temperature and density. Now, an area that is not an island, but also rewilding, can create a cushion, a temperature cushion deep into the soil, because the soil is remineralized. Because the cushion above ground. Now, what happened up until 100 years ago? The area was what? It was not a desert. It desertified before the big quake. We say, oh, but there were other big quakes there. we'll have to go all the way back to the Phoenicians and say that those folks built pyramids to be given a gnosis of orgasmic birthing, so we understand why there were earthquakes. Another thing that happens with orgasmic birthing and the microcosmic orbit is the attunement. Think about animals. If you have a cat or a dog before an earthquake, they would run and hide. Also, we the people. Sexual boundary violation causes people to lose. It causes inflammation in the brain, and it causes people to lose that attunement. So a lot of our thinking about resources is going back to the core, but from gnosis that we didn't have in empires. That's the Barbot Basket Golden Age thing that was building up. We have those that thought in terms of monetary, fiscal infrastructure, artificial energy infrastructure, and those that think in terms of the gnosis is coming from Cancer to Jupiter and the Moon, to the union of the Sun and Moon, to the bigger Sun. And we have, when it comes to energy, why does Norwegian use hydro energy when it has oil and gas? Now people could call it a liberation from slavery. What is a liberation from slavery? I had a filmmaking screenwriter teacher who was a lawyer and talked about screenwriting as carpentry. And he said every story, every film that's based about a classic plot is going from slavery to liberation. What is that slavery? It's the lack of gnosis. What is that liberation? It's that orgasmic birthing. After that, we no longer use these terms of slavery and liberation. We don't need. Why do the Jews look back to coming out of Egypt? Because they are not free. If you read Genesis. Now, going back to the story of Medici. Medici's father had a child outside of marriage. Acknowledged the child when it came to making sure that the child would prosper, that it have the funding. He couldn't acknowledge the child legally because it would confront him with the church. The ability to argue with the core beliefs and religions, including the solar ones, of the bankers and of the leaders, is this Jupiter-Pluto opposition, supported by Neptune, supported by Uranus. It's been building up. Everything. If we take a look at just took a look at Security Council 1325, I say, oh, when will that thing have a Saturn return? At 2030. What will happen in 2030? Oh, the Rahu and Sagittarius, Ketu, Gemini, um, co-present with Uranus, Saturn, Mars. Well, Saturn, Mars, better per se. We had Uranus, but Saturn ruling Pluto, Mars ruling Neptune. The last time we had these two giants on Beta Persei, we had we had but it was the mid 1800. We had I think it was even the end of the Inquisition. And now here is the thing, if they build an Inquisition to end it, it's a scam. What's the lovely thing about having the rulers rather than the planets? That the planets, right now in the Borbol basket as we see them, Pluto opposing Jupiter, Neptune trines, Uranus sextiles, that we know that we can surpass the ending of the Inquisition, because the ending of the Inquisition created a hidden Inquisition that was lasting all along. And that's the gnosis of the bigger sun. Now I'm broadcasting from capital city of the Negev, the city of the seven wells. And I was wondering, should I go today to bathe at the sea, low sun 22 inches maybe, or should I go to try and build a half moon there, but it's not yet a half moon, down the slopes of the Dead Sea? And I decided to make this forecast. And indeed, a midheaven accentuate. I said, let's talk about something that's not good for business. Because what seems to be like it's not good for business might be, and I'm telling you, it is the way to transcend not just intergenerational wealth and legacy across centuries. If you think about Da Vinci, we talk about 500 years. What I talked about also negates something to do with Sedna, and that's 1200, and that's 12 millennia, not 1200 years, 12 millennia, 12,000 years. Where was the world 12,000 years ago? People talking about global warming. Another competing paradigm looks at 12,000 millennia, something like 12,000 millennia, and see the ice ages and the livable ages. I just gave you the prescription for the livable ages. Now Sedna around my Chiron. Everything, the big conglomerates that we think about in terms of trade are not 12 millennia old. Now, this is a stamp, this is a footstep in frequency. It's a footstep in energy, in ether, but it's also a footstep in the oil, in the soil. The oil will not be surpassed without everything that I just said. But it also clear as day that something that lies on. And here's the thing, the oil conglomerates, you better bet that the Rockefeller, let's say, are already embedding and integrating what I'm saying. They are ready. They're just afraid that you are not. Rabbinical people know that genital mutilation and circumcision are one and the same. They are just afraid that the people will no longer believe it. Now, the common people, they have, they are already aware. They said, I was thinking about it, like circumcision is genital mutilation. It is what it is. And if they try to think about it in more, let's say, rite of passage ways, and they're like, kind of looks like a cult. Arranged marriage is human trafficking. Around the Me Too, we had a difficult time explaining women that came from trafficking that feminists are not against them, because they were like, what, a woman that sleeps with her husband for material security, is this not prostitute? Because in the golden age, not in the golden, in the gilded age, in the golden age, we don't even need to discuss those things, because sexuality is embodied. And because people are not enslaved, we don't restrict them to who can marry and breed and who can. And when we have orgasmic birthing and happy upbringings, then the choices, the erotic or the relational choices, are choices. They're not deprivation-based biases. It looks like it's not good for business, but it can sustain the lineage. For example, a lot has been done to try to think, how will the lineage sustain a big war? Then people try to control the wars or to benefit from the wars. Um, in 1963, John F. Kennedy gave the biggest answer. We still have Kennedys today, even with the family weirdness, to prevent the war. Now, preventing a war is not done by peace. is done by saying the things that are difficult to say. When we need to say them. People pleasing causes people to feel betrayed. And indeed, Libra, that is opposing Aries, the sign of war, Libra is the sign of diplomacy. Now, excessively people pleasing causes what? War. We have silver, they have nutmeg. We could trade, but we don't feel comfortable. So we want to keep the silver. Why would we want to keep the silver? Because we're deprived of nourishment. We're afraid that we won't have. We're afraid that they're going to inquisition us like, so what, shit ton of violence over nothing. Now, again, I don't know who lived there. He could have been trying to be diplomat. And if you ask Dutchies in a more relaxed, some would tell you that they weren't exactly saints there in Suriname. And not that saints, but now Neptune deals with, in Aries, the name calling for example, what is illegitimate child? What is Da Vinci illegitimate child? It's a name calling for a child that was born outside of the orchestration of the church, which was a human trafficking orchestration. And that child renovated, he created the Renaissance. Now, his father was smart. He's not going to argue with the church, but he's going to fund. Now, why not going to? Because that would bring up another argument. Maybe the father wanted to divorce and marry another woman. Maybe he didn't even, but maybe he would divorce and marry another woman and would find out that he actually wants to be single. Or he's gay, I don't know. But he didn't even have the opportunity to get to know himself because the resources were tied erotically. What is that when the resources are erotically tied and not in an orgasmic birth in microcosmic orbit way? Human trafficking. In the Gilded Age, the courtesans had the freedom that the married woman didn't have. A Viking woman had more freedom than some monarch women. Still, and you say, how do we top the Vikings? Don't sacrifice women. Yeah. Would the Vikings need to Christianify if they didn't sacrifice women? I think not. Why? Because to not sacrifice women, it would mean that their entire esoterics would honor the feminine. And then they would have the less need in war, and they would be even more competent at war. Now, it's very weird to say more competent at war to the Vikings. But it's true. That's the spirit of these times. Is not thinking, how do I what did Rockefeller do that created wealth for, let's say, 300 years? Not really 300, but when we have doors opening for 12 millennia. Now, naturally, if we think about, if I think about finding a job, whereas I think about the same thing, finding a job, but while I already prepared the pitch to be one of the entrepreneurs that own branches of the company. Two completely different mindset. If I'm thinking about finding a job, I don't see my future. That can make me very incompetent. It can make the business very dissatisfied. It can make us a lot stressed and worried. It can create an atmosphere for a lot of feeling betrayed, feeling oppressed, feeling. If I'm already working, let's say I rent a house. The more I like the house, the better, the most terrible tenant I am. Because I actually want to buy the house. It's not about trickery or cunningness. It's about the fact that internally, I like this place. I would like to buy this place. I'd like to renovate. I'd like to this. I'd like to that. But if, right from advance, I say, listen, if I like the house, I would want to buy the house. I'd like to see an estate where that would be possible. And then I can move in as tenant, and my monthly payments will be going to the first installment, and or buying the house or buying the land. It is also more reasonable because otherwise, why am I here as tenant? What is it? The slavery? Is it the feudalism? And if I can't grow, then what will happen to the landlord? A cancer tumor. Why ether, energy? Not because of curses. It's the energy flow across time and materia. Now, also for me, I would begin to develop weird things, but I will need to grow. This is why in the lineages, some of the aristocratic lineages, there were a lot of what? Genetic mutation. Now, when you think about it, those things governed, let's say Chernobyl, that's still leaking. It's a generator of genetic mutation. Now we think about the microcosmic orbit, the gnosis of the bigger sun, and what a different trajectory it creates for the entire world. At the first trajectory, anyway, they will have to come to the decision too. There were 2 world wars, suffragists, LGBTQ, disabled people were at the death camps. Essentially, what did they have to give? Food stamps, welfare stamps, free emergency care, right to vote for women. They eventually they had to give the rights. The other gnosis will say, hey, we don't need to go through nuclear holocaust and then to have the years of the soil rewilding itself to do the same thing that we can throw some beavers across the Dead Sea slopes or rewild the area, practice the gnosis of orgasmic birthing, the bigger gnosis. The curation to the attachment patterns of people are there. Eventually, they'll have to come to that conclusion. Think about United States, MK Ultra, MK Ultra. What did they do? They did mind controlled people. Now, recently, they admitted that some serial killers were mind controlled for the MK Ultra. Eventually, they had to provide for secure attachment. The teaching of secure attachment came, attachment styles, providing for how to create attachment. Did we have to get to the point where we get to the bubble of 30 million files of the Epstein dropping, exposing that that thing was done across the world? And now it's in tandem. Either this big empire says it's Israel, which is kind of like a speck, and then it says it cannot say it's Israel. It says Rockefeller, it's Rothschild. That makes at least sense. Or they have to say it's us. In which case, we don't need, by the way, nobody needs to nuclear bomb the United States. The United States nuclear bombs itself all the time. It's like the Chernobyl leaking. And all of that is over nothing. There's a guy that bought some land in Texas, arid land, and he begins to build dams. Maybe he can tow some beavers. Texas won't be looking the same. It would have hydro energy. The regimes that sustain through even the Taliban are very either matriarchal or incredibly equal. Eventually, the world will have to become more like them. Global village, local village, globalist, localist, tribalist. If the tribe is not to be eaten away, sometimes literally, it has to become a little bit more like the Kalash people. Even a lot. And people say, oh, there were natural births, and the birth was the right of women taking sovereignty from other women at birth. Oh, then men did that with technology. Now, this transit, the big transit, begs the question, do we need to go to the big wars to have the same gnosis? Or can we just, to the best of our ability, practice this gnosis already in this time? I know my choice. Because I understood any way they will have